and thanks to Senators Brown and Scott for hosting this important hearing. I'm working with some of my colleagues on some legislation related to clawbacks, and so I'm going to focus my line of questioning just on some very specific applications of how those potential statutes might work in practice. In particular, what we're worried about is, you take a situation like Silicon Valley Bank where executives paid themselves out very large amounts of money in the weeks and months leading up to the failure. And what's especially sick about this, of course, is the taxpayers end up bearing a lot of the risk of those failed decision-making, I should say, and the executives end up running away like bandits. And that strikes me as an especially unfair way to run a banking system where you can screw things up, pay yourself out fat bonuses, and then taxpayers end up dealing with the downside risk. So two particular questions that have sort of come up in the conversations I've had with colleagues about this, sort of how to narrowly tailor this such that you're targeting the bank executives who caused these problems and not, let's say, an administrative assistant or a bank teller who had no decision-making authority in what ultimately led to the bank's collapse, whether that's Silicon Valley Bank or somebody else. So this first question is going to Mr. Quadman, and the question here is, can you explain who gets caught up in the statutory definition of a, quote, institution-affiliated party? What could that potentially capture a bank teller, an administrative assistant to an executive? Sort of how broad does that sweep? Because that influences how we draft this thing.
It actually, it's extremely broad. You can also be talking about an accounting firm or a law firm that is providing services to that banking institution as well. So, of course, lawyers and accountants are also extremely important for management and governance purposes. Firms would be reluctant to engage with a business if that provision was there. And that, again, goes towards the talent issues and management issues. So that is an issue of particular concern that we have.
Great. Okay. That's helpful to know, and certainly a good knowledge for us to have. So, Professor Schooner, wanted to sort of direct this question to you. So one of the things that's sort of come up again on this question of narrowing is the question of directors and whether they should be liable under some of these clawback provisions. And I know from my time in the private sector that director usually means a member of the board of directors, but sometimes it could be a director of marketing or director of business development. So particularly that word, if you were to expose directors to clawback liability, do you think that could be reasonably interpreted by a court or a regulator to cover mid-level managers who have the director title? Or do you think that would understandably by most be applied only to a member of the board of directors?
Senator, I think it would only be applied to the member of the board of directors. I've never seen that term used in a statute used to apply to anybody other than the board. In other words, the term director is really taken from the incorporation of the entity, and the responsible managers are the board of directors. So I would be very surprised if it was interpreted that way.
Got it. I would love to get that answer to that question from Mr. Quadman and Ms. Dillon.
In reviewing some of the legislation announcements around it regarding the Warren-Hawley bill, I think some of it could be, I agree in terms of the director issue, but I think some of the definitions could include line employees as well, which I don't believe is the intent. I think it's more trying to be direct around senior executives and others, where traditionally these compensation issues are more aligned. We have other concerns with the legislation, but we do think it could be overbroad.
What is it that you think that could apply to line employees?
I think it's how it's defined.
Okay.
Because if you look at other compensation statutes, there are specific levels that are defined as to where entities, as to who it applies to.
Got it. Okay, Ms. Lynn.
I agree with Professor Schooner, Senator, that directors are typically used to refer to the board of directors. And in fact, in several provisions, for example, in 1818E5, the term directors and officers are specifically defined in a way that also enumerates activities such as substantial participation. And so the focus of the statute and the aim of the statute has been always to deter, I use the term directors to mean boards of directors.
Got it. Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate it. I yield.